This definitely does have its fair share of cheapness, like the obvious trope of having Isaac dredge through a daycare center complete with child necromorphs. But it also sends us through a church of ontology, which gives us better insight into how these people tick and what they're like when they're not sabotaging big rusty planet crackers. If the environmental storytelling wowed you in the first game, get ready for that exact same experience, but more of it. I will admit the story's got a different feel from the first games, but I think it still lives up to that Dead Space name. The original had this slow building, kind of gritty, dark thing going on, and the second is a lot more in your face, but it still retains some kind of authenticity. And from a storytelling perspective, this change makes a lot of sense. We as players already know what's after us in the dark corners of this space station, and we're already familiar with what's capable. So it makes sense to start us in the heat of all the action. I mean, if it's slowly revealed in Necromantis, I would have likely gotten a little bored, totally knowing what was coming next. Honestly, though, I think the best example of how things have changed would be the fact that Isaac not only has a face now, but a personality to go along with it.
They're talking through a hole in the medical deck. They should want to go through there. Unexited construction here. Shut your down.
Crap. And I think I might be torn on this issue. On one hand, he had so much character when all we had to gauge his reactions by were his labored breaths, screams of terror, and body language. And all that's gone now that he can properly express himself. But I really do like his personality in this game. You have a pretty even split between wisecracking action hero and deeply damaged, nearly crazy person who just can't let go of the guilt he feels for the role he played in Colt's fate. He grows attached to the other characters in the game, gets angry with them, even expresses frustration that mirrors my own with the old Dead Space trope of nothing working rears its ugly head.
It doesn't recognize the instruction. Ending up right from here. What? What do you mean? Nothing. Nothing.
This new side of Isaac is a contentious one, and while I do really enjoy his personality, I can't exactly argue that I would have loved for him to remain the silent protagonist. So this will be a subjective tip, but if you're worried about Visceral ruining a unique character by having him speak, you're not exactly in the wrong, but I found this new personality to be really engaging to me. So, yeah, maybe there is a bit of the original allure lost now that he can actively comment on things, but it is replaced with what I feel is pretty organic and believable writing, so I guess take that for what it's worth. And since we're talking about differences, it's only fair we talk about how Dead Space 2 stays the same. You'll still be following a voice on your radio, and while you'll often come within mere inches from the people you're communicating with, you aren't going to be fighting back to back with them or anything. If this bothered you in the first game, it will likely have the same effect here, but I really feel like this one shows you something like the isolating atmosphere of Dead Space so much more. So I guess we'll call it necessary evil. And to the perspective, as it is, it stays the same. One of the sequel to it's basically satisfied the game, and she its broken explain, which made the first game perfectly. It shows the government people this world all fleshed out, just a little bit before. Not so much, it's not really interesting and mysterious. Just like before, a lot of the background narrative is handled via text and audio logs, and just like before, these little pieces of self-contained world building are amazingly lost in. I will say I was a little disappointed when I noticed that there were far fewer audio recordings than before, with text logs being a majority of what you're going to find, but hey, I'm not opposed to doing a bit of reading if it means getting to know a little bit more about this world and how it operates. I do, however, wonder why this is the case. You would figure that the increased budget would mean more voice actors being able to contribute for more lines, but let's not get lost in minutia. And speaking of minutia, I'd love to start talking a little more specifically, but before I do, I have to throw up a little bit of a spoiler warning here. So if you haven't played through Dead Space 2 yet, skip to the timestamp on screen, or click the link in the description to avoid having this awesome tale spoiled for you. Alright, so now that the first timers are gone, we can talk shit about it. Maybe this story. In the first game, we found out that Nicole had been dead the entire time. This time around, they still have Isaac in absolute torment, because he essentially pushed her to join the crew of the Planet Cracker, in a sense dooming her to her own death. And as we near the end of Part 2, you start to see Isaac come to grips with this fact. And as he does, Nicole stops showing up as some kind of evil specter, and more like a helping hand. I felt like this plot thread was handled really well. Isaac struggles because he doesn't want to let her go, despite the fact that she's tricked him into almost killing himself several times by this point. Even though he thinks it'll eventually kill him, and this was a really cool metaphor for him holding onto his baggage and making his life worse. When you hear that a game will be covering sensitive subjects like loss, depression, and suicidal thoughts, you always hope for the best, but often we're left with shallow or exploitative writing that just sort of cheapens these concepts. And for a while, I was really impressed that Visual pulled off such a touchy subject with such class. That is, until it was all taken apart a few minutes after the confrontation. This all just happened about so he could be absorbed. And don't get me wrong, this last backstab I thought was really effective. But honestly, I would have been more satisfied if this turned out to be a little more like Silent Hill 2, where the main character struggles with an issue and the end coincides with him or her making peace with their inner demons and letting them go. Maybe it's just me, but I was all on board the Isaac using the part of his brain that the marker affected to destroy it, but at the cost of not seeing the apparition of his dead love anymore. If you ask me, this would have been the better way to go, but that being said, I'm not exactly complaining. I just would have liked to have seen the other option explored as well, maybe as an alternate ending or something like that. And real quick, before we let everyone else back in, I just wanted to say that I absolutely loved this game's ending. No analysis or critique here, I was just really blown away at how, for lack of a better word, epic it was. By the time the ending credits started rolling, I genuinely found myself letting out a sigh of relief, like I'd been tightening myself up the entire ending sequence. Really grade A stuff, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Alright, so I think that's enough gushing. Let's let the rest of the crew back in. Okay, so time to put the cards on the table. I was completely blown away by Dead Space 2's story. At first, I lamented how Isaac shed his silent protect nature and Dawn an honest-to-goodness personality, but I genuinely grew to love it. In that same sense, I really didn't like the stereotypical two-dimensional character Ellie at first. The game introduced you to her as your average tame shit hard-ass character, and in any other game you just know you can sniper. But as the two interact more and more, she becomes this really personality, and that makes the whole badass thing even more emotionally attractive. Typically, I would use this spot in the script for critiques or issues, but I genuinely had none. The story was amazingly satisfying. It had all the explosions and melodrama that a typical action flick would, but also included the emotional conflict that I would expect from a story genre. For every single step it took towards that achievement, slotting popcorn through a field, it took another in the direction of a serious, dark, and brooding game with massive amounts of world building in an in-game universe that feels equal parts science fiction and damn near realism. The pace of the story's events, make sure you don't go too long a stretch without it stepping in and reminding you this is a story-driven experience, but also won't have you sit through 40-minute cutscenes before you get a chance to start disemboweling Never once again. So an even section of both sides of the spectrum is represented here. And right about now, I'm going to say something that is likely to not be very popular. Okay, here we go. So, I enjoyed the tale this game told in orders of magnitude more than the original. Now, wait a second before you authorize the main strike on my house. The first game was amazing. Its story was wonderful. It was earnest, honest, and not anything like what you would expect from a game that released in its console generation. But Dead Space 2 pulled off the nearly impossible trick of receiving a massive budgetary boost while keeping the spirit of the original intact. I trust.
Over here, public sector is already beyond acceptable recovery conditions. I can't allow my people to escape. Goodbye, Clark.
Sure, we've lost the small, endearing, almost self-contained nature of the first game's story, but what we got in the sequel was the developers pouring just as much heart and soul into it, with the added bonus of expanding the concepts introduced before. Dead Space 1 is a underdog playoffs and then beating the seasoned team all on his own, and Part 2 is that same guy coming back after spending years in training and actually accomplishing it all. It was not as much of an upset as some young upstart coming into the veteran AAA gaming space and wrecking everyone's shit with a quarter of the budget, but the quality never notched had been cranked to 11 here. I mean, honestly, it's damn near perfect in my opinion. And I know you guys might not have been expecting that out of me. I do spend the majority of my time playing with 100-hour RPGs with rich and immersive worlds, but this big budget third-person shooter has me gushing for some reason. And, well, don't worry, it surprised me too. Maybe I'm just a sucker for dark and realistic science fiction stories with a twist of psychological horror thrown in. After all, one of my favorite movies is Event Horizon, but for whatever reason, I absolutely cannot recommend this story enough. Even if you're worried about your gaming skills not being up to snuff, I'd say an easy run is more than worth it to experience this tale for yourself. This might be one of the biggest blindsides I've had in a while. Maybe it'll have a similar effect on you, or maybe it's the only game I've ever played that let me actively take part in shoving a needle into a person's eye, and that's something I can really get behind. Okay, so we all hopefully know what Dead Space is all about by now. Long corridors leading to open areas where piles of twisted bones and corrupted flesh jump you in a fight, requiring some limb from torso separation, with light physics puzzles on top for good measure. And in that sense, Dead Space 2 is certainly not reinventing the wheel here. But what they have done is what any developer should do for a good sequel. They brought nearly the same exact formula to the table, but with small additions and even smaller alterations that have what was always aka shit that the gaming industry never intended. The main alteration that immediately comes to mind is a much larger focus on using the game's telekinesis mechanic to better use your environment as a weapon. Now don't get me wrong, blowing off a leg and 2 arms is still the go-to move, but literally nothing is more satisfying than picking up a long, sharp implement and firing it into these guys with such force that it literally pins their lifeless carcass to a wall. No joke, this is a kind of therapy for me, and you know what? I'm not ashamed to say that. Now, of course, this was something that was possible to some degree in the original game and stuff like Buzzsaws, but here you'll notice these environmental elements are present in nearly every fight you're going to have, and now even the Necromorph's own belief is getting weapon instantly changing things up. After taking out one of these things, sharpened bone spikes, you can pick it up and skewer them with it, and now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not too sure if this is a returning mechanic from the first game that I just never used. Well, regardless, it is fun as hell. Even help me conserve ammo in more than a few situations. This mechanic really plays into your target choices in a fight. A higher priority target might be launching projectiles at you from afar, and he might be the obvious choice when there's just low-level melee baddies simultaneously rushing you. But taking these guys out first means filling the environment with potentially deadly weapons to use against the stronger ones. At first, I had issues instinctively opting for this tactic, but it wasn't more than a few hours till I really grasped the concept and was making use of every available option in combat. Sticking with the game's combat, I did something a little differently compared to my playthrough of the first game. If you'll remember, I was a little let down at how relatively easy Dead Space 1 was. I mean, I did die a few times, but for 99% of the game, I was steamrolling enemies with a starting weapon, and even ended up selling my other weapons because I was never really in a position to do anything else. So when it came time to start Dead Space 2, I opted for the next step up in difficulty. And I will say right now, with no doubt in my mind, that this is the true way to experience this game. And no, I'm not one of those assholes that thinks difficulty necessarily translates into good gameplay. And anyone who stuck around for one of my streams knows I'm not MLG material by any stretch of the imagination. Are you guys serious? How about now? Just come out. I'm a little upset. I'm a little upset with you guys right now, to be honest. I'm more disappointed than anything, if I'm being totally honest. But despite this choice saying we did a game of history, come on! Even smaller changes make for so much more of a satisfying experience. I would come to a wide open combat scenario and die over and over again, and instead of blaming RNG or hoping I do better next time, I was changing up my tactics and trying to better utilize the environment in my favor. Did I miss a few explosive canisters scattered around, or was it just me forgetting to use my stasis ability again? After getting absolutely demolished in an area, I loaded up my save game and strapped in with the intention of changing up my strategy and trying to shoot more accurately while fighting off an absolute onslaught of bad guys. At the end of one of the more punishing fights, I always felt like the guy was just kind of satisfying. So this was the time as it was always this was too broad and difficult. All the more reason to allow since I was slightly small scale. Possible situation. Instead of shooting gallery level enemies rushing me from far away while I picked them off with ease like in the first game, I was being swung from all sides, and while it was grindingly difficult, it also felt incredibly fair. For example, I might get hit by a necromorph from behind and I just didn't even know he was there. But then in fighting him, I'd notice where he came from, and then I would start noticing all the entries into the room, behind windows and air vents. Then I would just demolish the entire fight. It felt like it asked for the perfect amount of effort out of me. I never restarted the fight saying, oh, how the hell was I supposed to do that? I was honestly in awe at how much fun I was having this time around. And just to reiterate, I really enjoyed the first game, but to further drive that point home, here's a new end-game fight from Dead Space 1. I'm taking a lot of damage here, but as you can see, that's mostly due to me not needing to worry about avoiding attacks, and there's no real strategy being deployed. Necromorphs are showing up from nearly all sides, but at such a long distance that I can just pop them with stasis, blow off a couple limbs, and eat any damage from enemies I neglected, while slowly picking my shots. Honestly, looking at it now, it seems like a big downgrade given the context. Now taking a look at an in-game fight in Dead Space 2, and it is a night-and-day comparison. Necromorphs are getting right in my face, and I'm having to pick targets on the fly at an insane pace. I'm needing to use crowd control by using pain states to pop multiple enemies with non-lethal shots, just to get a microsecond breathing room so I can line up the more damaging stuff. I'm also needing to react way faster to threats here. As you can see, I'm moving my mouse a mile a minute trying to keep up with these fools, and instead of reloading, I was having to switch to another weapon just to make sure I wasn't left over in cheap hits. Which, by the way, is all it takes for these guys to take me down, despite me having a fully upgraded suit. Despite the fact that I make a living trying to describe my experience in the video game, it's just really hard to put words together that will tell you how satisfying this is. When the chaos and pace in which most fights took place forced me to play better, by the end I just felt like an absolute badass, which is what I expect from most action games. Listen, I know this sounds like me bragging at how great I am at this game, but believe me, I died easily 100 times more in this playthrough. And each time I was completely stoked to jump back in and see how I could better approach the skirmish that got the best of me. If you take any advice from me in this video, give Dead Space 2 a try on survivalist. It felt to me like the perfect combination of difficulty and satisfaction. Trust me, you will not regret it. To the footage up to this point, you might have noticed a small difference between the first and second games. One that's tiny but adds a very dynamic game in each fight. Instead of enemies just spitting out items on death, you need to do extra damage once you down them to collect any kind of. This really switched up my approach to fights, and even though it's a small little alteration, it felt like a perfect direction to take the game's combat in. Now, it really doesn't matter how much damage it is as long as the enemy's down, which does help it not feel cheap, but once you realize even throwing a bloody hand at them counts, it sort of cheapens the effect to a degree. On top of that, I really like having secondary weapons this time around. Like I said in my last video, I really never felt the need to use something other than starting a plasma cutter since it was easily the most efficient weapon in the game. But I routinely needed to switch weapons to better deal with groups or certain enemy types this time around. It felt really good to be in a bad situation until I pulled out the pulse rifle to get a little room, or using the javelin to not only crucify a necromorph, but its secondary fire to electrocute the others around him. Unlike the first game, I often found myself nearly out of ammo, although I only ever truly ran out once. Still, though, the stress of running low had me using my other weapons, which is good, and all around, I guess the takeaway is I just absolutely loved the combat here. The additions and alterations all combined together to make a much more satisfying experience than the first, and again, I loved the first game's combat. So that really threw me for a loop. As the game went on, I kept meeting bigger and bigger challenges, and this led to a real feeling of accomplishment when I got to the end. As Isaac took off his helmet and breathed a sigh of relief, I was right there with him. Of course, you guys know Dead Space ain't all action, and On that note, I'm happy to say the slow-building dread of exploring a place recently invaded by an alien corpse virus is still 100% present. And what I mean by that is there's still a lot of quiet time for you to really soak in your surroundings. The in-your-face way the game starts might have you believing otherwise, but even a few minutes into that very sequence, you'll see enough slow-building atmosphere to disprove that little worry. This time around, the place you're exploring has been more recently overrun, so you get this closer connection between the environment and the events that happen here to make the environment look like it does. At first, I was worried the team would add more action to the game, going off the carefully balanced ratio achieved in the first, but instead the guys at Visceral just expanded the size of everything, so an increase on one side meant an even increase on the other. So if my little tirade on the combat got you worried, trust me, you don't have to be. You're still going to spend plenty of time slowly scoping through dark hallways with blood-smeared walls while a single light fixture flickers off in the distance. And do keep in mind, I come into horror games wanting to spend more time in the dark, feeling around for a light switch, and less time partaking in pulse-pounding action, so this game getting such high marks for me despite having so much action really says something about how effective that horror is. Continuing with the theme of additions, the zero-gravity portions have made a return, but this time with the added bonus of full 360-degree movement, which is exactly what this mechanic needed. It feels like the next obvious upgrade to make for a sequel, and it works perfectly here. You're not going to see it very often, but when you do, it's almost always fun time. Plus, it helps break up the gameplay once you spend a long portion of the game either blasting eldritch horrors or walking through their aftermath. The workbenches make their obvious return, and the upgrade system works just as well as it did before, only this time I felt like I was less flush with power nodes at the end. Physics-based puzzles seem to be slightly more complicated than they were in the first game, forcing me to align mirrors and move stuff around in the environment more with kinesis. Now, of course, they still aren't going to hit Silent Hill levels of challenging, but then again, they help break up the general gameplay loop and walk that thin line between being complicated enough that it doesn't become a bore, but also simple enough that I can typically figure them out just by looking them over a few seconds. So they're not going to give your brain to work out, but they still serve their purpose very well. Obviously, the pride and joy of the series is still alive and kicking, that being the Elite Dismemberment system, and very true to form, they give you about 5 bajillion hints as to how that works, including in-game audio logs, actual graffiti in the environment, and intrusive tutorial messages. And while we're on the subject, these messages stick around way too damn long. Continuing with these sort of downsides, the new enemies are all really interesting and bring their own strategies to the combat, but 2 of them really piss me off in very specific situations. This acid-spitting asshole is fine enough on his own, but later on in the game, as the difficulty is ramping up and the swarms of Necromorphs seem to number in the hundreds, these guys will show up and spit their sludge at you from across the room. And with the chaos, fighting off nearly infinite amounts of other bad guys, you'll often not hear his call-out, so you'll have no idea he's even in the area until you get hit by him. And to be fair, this wouldn't be such an issue if his long-distance shoot stomach acid at you from beyond the physical playfield attack just damaged you. Honestly, I was pretty flush with healing items nearly this entire playthrough, but on top of the damage, it also prevents you from running while slowing down your walk speed to an absolute crawl. Once this jerk gets hit in on you, you're almost guaranteed to subsequent death if there's any other enemy still in play. So I learned to keep my head on a swivel and look out for his half-melted form, but I'd still get the odd cheap hit from him. And rounding off the list is this bigger sort of big boss type of melee-based guy with long arms. Dealing with him isn't much of an issue most of the time, just a quick stasis shot and unload on all his weak points. But he has a lunging jump attack that once activated, the game just gives you 0 tools to deal with. I mean, Isaac's run speed is relatively slow, and instead of focusing on mobility, the game pushes fast thinking and even faster target finding. But I couldn't find any way to knock him out of this attack, and a slow run speed matched with the absence of any kind of dodge mechanic. The only hope once he initiates this move was to pray that you were already out of range when he started it, because if you weren't, it doesn't matter how far you run and which direction you are getting hit. Maybe giving this move a buttload of wind-up or some kind of obvious startup frames would have helped, but as it is, if he's already in the air, it's that big points. So I'm perfectly wants to satisfy the combat at this point. That's on the side of the match. That being said, I had some issues lining up my mouse's sensitivity with the in-game sensitivity slider. It took me a real long time to get the perfect equilibrium between the two, but I am willing to admit this might just be an issue with me and how I like to play. By now, you guys may have noticed that I didn't really give an overview of how this game plays, and instead skipped straight to specific examples of what has changed. And, well, that's because the majority of Dead Space 2 is just Dead Space 1, and that is a compliment. Too often in the AAA gaming space, developers throw the baby out with the bathwater when a sequel comes around, and while it may be an awesome game, it's just not what we wanted from a follow-up. Sorry, I must have something in my throat. Anyways, it's nice to see that these guys were confident enough in their original formula that they only sought to add to it instead of taking away. So if you did like Dead Space 1, I just cannot foresee a reason why you wouldn't like Part 2. And that does set us down a very interesting path. No matter how much I absolutely loved this gameplay experience, the public at large seems to not be in agreement with it. Sales in Part 2 were updated, and the scant amount of info on Wikipedia is to be believed. I've seen a lot of varied numbers, but it looks like the game